My father raised his glass at the dinner table, looked straight at my sister, and called her his real legacy. Not me, not my son, just her. And my 10-year-old boy, sitting right beside me, quietly looked down at his plate and whispered, barely loud enough for me to hear, "What about me?" I kissed the top of his head. I stood up, and I said something that made my father almost choke on his drink, made my sister's smile collapse like a building falling in slow motion, and made the entire room go so completely silent that you could hear the candles flickering. What I said, I'll get to that. But first, you need to understand the kind of family I grew up in, because without that context, you won't fully grasp why one dinner changed absolutely everything. My sister Claire had always been the favorite, not in a subtle, easy to explain away kind of way, in a loud, undeniable, on display for everyone kind of way. She had 2 kids, a boy and a girl, both of whom my father treated like royalty. He memorized their school schedules. He sent them brand new iPads every single year. He gave them the keys to his house before they were even 16 years old. He called them his reason for living. My son, Jamie, was 10. He was small for his age, quiet by nature, and honestly smarter than most adults I've ever known. But to my father, he was practically invisible. Dad never came to watch him play soccer, never once asked about his science projects, never said, "I'm proud of you." Not once. I kept making excuses for it. He's forgetful. He's old-fashioned. He doesn't express himself well. But I knew the truth. Underneath all those excuses, he simply loved Claire's children more, and no amount of rationalization could change that. After that night, I made a decision. No more dinners, no more performances. I was done dragging my son into rooms where he was invisible. If cutting my father out of our lives was the price of protecting Jamie's sense of worth, I was willing to pay it. I stopped answering the phone, quietly. No dramatic speech. I just stopped. 6 months passed, peaceful, settled, and then, one Tuesday morning, my phone rang. It was the hospital. My father had been in a single car accident on the freeway, head trauma, internal bleeding, possible spinal damage. They weren't sure he'd survive the night. I sat with the phone pressed to my cheek, completely still. Jamie was watching me from the kitchen doorway. When I told him what happened, his face went blank. Not sad, not scared, just blank. Like he genuinely didn't know how to feel about a man who had never made him feel anything good. I thought about not going. Claire would handle it. She always stepped into the spotlight for moments like this. She'd be the grieving daughter, the devoted child, managing everything with perfect composure and probably a freshly pressed blazer. But something shifted in me. I packed 2 bags, one for Jamie, one for me, and I drove to the hospital without telling anyone. The waiting room was empty. I asked the nurse at the desk about my father. She looked up and said, "You must be Melody. You're the only family who's come." I thought I'd misheard. I asked again. She confirmed it, just me, just Jamie. When I walked into his room, I almost didn't recognize him. He looked smaller than I remembered, older, surrounded by machines and wires, and the steady rhythm of beeping monitors. Jamie stood behind me, and when I glanced back at him, he gave me a small nod. I want to stay, so he stayed. All night, no calls from Claire. No one showed up. In the morning, I called her. No answer. I texted. Nothing. By noon, I learned the truth from a nurse who let something slip. Claire had been calling the hospital repeatedly, not to ask how he was doing in any meaningful sense, but to ask about his condition and legal matters. Specifically, she'd asked whether there was a will on file. A will, while he was still on a ventilator. I laughed, but it felt like something cracking open inside me. rather than anything resembling humor. For 3 days, Jamie and I stayed. I brought him snacks from the vending machine, helped him with homework at the little table in the corner of the room. He drew on my tablet to pass the time. One drawing was of his grandfather lying in the hospital bed, wires curling around him like vines, and above the bed, a small floating heart. I asked him why he drew the heart. He said, because maybe now he loves me a little. Left a voicemail, smooth, practiced, professional. Said there were documents needing clarification. Said Claire was protecting everyone's interests. Said there shouldn't be any unexpected claims. Claims, as if my son and I were legal liabilities. As if we weren't the only people standing in that room, making sure this man didn't die alone. I didn't respond. I just kept showing up. On the 4th night, around 3 a.m., his eyes opened. Just for a second, but they opened. He looked around the room, disoriented, confused, his brain slowly rebooting. His gaze moved across the ceiling, across the machines, and then it landed on me. Then it found Jamie. He stared at him for a long time, longer than I expected, like he was genuinely seeing him, perhaps for the very first time. And Jamie, bless him, didn't say a word. He just gave a small, quiet nod, like he was granting permission, like he was saying, "It's okay, you can see me now." That kind of grace in a 10-year-old. I don't have the words for it. I pressed the call button. The nurses came, the room filled with movement and urgency. They asked us to step out. Out in the hallway, I finally checked my phone. A voicemail from a number I didn't recognize. One of my dad's attorneys, asking to speak with all next of kin immediately. I didn't call back. Not yet. An hour later, we were allowed back in. He was fully conscious, weak, slow, but awake. The doctor noted, almost as an aside, that my father had been asking who had been there with him. When they told him I hadn't left since the night he was admitted, he went quiet. Back in the room, he struggled to sit up. A nurse adjusted his bed, and then he looked at me and asked, simply, "Why are you here?" Just genuinely confused, like my being there didn't fit any story he knew how to tell about himself. I told him it didn't matter. He was here. We were here. That was enough. And he asked where Claire was. I told him the truth. She hadn't come once, not a single call. He didn't believe me, so I showed him the visitor log. 4 days of entries, and only 2 names appeared, mine and Jamie's. He stared at those pages for a long time. His eyes filled, but he didn't speak. He just laid back, closed his eyes, and stayed quiet for the rest of the day. That night, he asked Jamie if he could draw something for him, anything at all. Jaime drew a tree with deep, sprawling roots. Underneath it, he wrote 4 words in his careful 10-year-old handwriting. "We're still here." My father didn't take his eyes off that piece of paper for the rest of the night. The next morning, Claire arrived. Not with flowers, not with food, certainly not with an apology. She arrived with her lawyer. She walked into that ICU room like she was there for a board meeting. Perfect hair, pressed blazer, phone already in hand, attorney trailing 1 step behind her with a slim briefcase. She stopped when she saw me. Then she saw Jamie, and her face did something I'll never forget. It didn't show shock or guilt. It showed calculation. "Dad," she said, stepping toward the bed. "Oh my God, I was so worried." He didn't respond right away. He just watched her the same way he'd watched Jamie the night before, like he was looking at something clearly for the first time. Her lawyer cleared his throat, introduced himself, and started talking about medical directives and power of attorney, smoothly, professionally, like none of this was unusual. My father raised one hand, weak, trembling, but deliberate. Stop. The room went quiet. He asked Claire where she had been. She had the kids. Hospitals are hard for them. She'd been calling. She didn't want to overwhelm him. She was handling things. He asked how many times she had actually come to see him. She glanced at her lawyer. That glance was all the answer anyone needed. My father told her the doctors had already filled him in. The visitor log. Who sat with him when his blood pressure dropped? Who was there when he woke up confused and terrified? Who held his hand when he couldn't move? He looked at Jamie, then at me. You were here, he said. Not a question, a recognition. Claire laughed nervously, said I was exaggerating, said she had been busy making sure everything was handled properly. He asked what she meant by everything. Her lawyer tried to redirect. Estate planning, asset protection, making sure his intentions were respected. My father's jaw tightened. He asked if she had already begun moving things around, if she had assumed he wasn't coming back. Claire said she was just being practical. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he looked exhausted in a way that went far beyond physical recovery. It was a bone-deep, soul-level kind of tired. He told her to leave. She laughed, like it was a joke. Then she looked around the room and realized no one was smiling. Not me, not Jamie, not the nurse who had quietly stepped in and was standing near the door. She tried one more time. She said she was his daughter. She said she deserved to be there. He told her she had already made her choice. Security came, not dramatically, just calmly, almost gently. First the lawyer, then Claire. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just looked at me on her way out with an expression I recognized instantly. The look of someone who believes something has been stolen from them, something they never actually owned. After they were gone, my father asked me to sit closer. He looked at Jamie for a long moment. Then he said he was sorry, not quickly, not as a reflex, a real, weighted, deliberate apology. And for the first time in my life, I believed him. 2 days after Claire was escorted out, I received a call from my father's financial advisor. My dad had requested an urgent meeting with me. Jaime was asleep in the recliner next to the hospital bed when I left. The nurses promised to watch over him. The advisor met me in a small office near the hospital. Plain, quiet, just a desk and 2 chairs. He looked uncomfortable, like a man who knew the information he was about to share would cause serious ripples. He slid a thick folder across the table. I opened it. Claire's name was on almost everything. A joint account, a deed to the house she'd been bragging about receiving as a gift for years, a $50,000 education trust for each of her children, stock portfolios, insurance beneficiaries. My name appeared on exactly 2 lines as a next of kin notation and an outdated emergency contact form. The advisor didn't say it outright, but I could see what he was thinking. Claire had been positioning herself for a long time. The timing of her lawyer calls within 24 hours of the accident wasn't a coincidence. I asked if anything could be changed. He said it was possible, provided my father's mental competency was formally confirmed. The evaluation happened the next day. My dad passed every cognitive test, slower than usual, but clear, focused, and fully present. When the advisor returned with a notary, my father revised everything. He removed Claire as a joint account holder, transferred the house back into his sole name, dissolved the trust, revoked the power of attorney she'd been quietly working to activate. Then he looked across the room at Jamie, who had just wandered in from the hallway, holding 2 bags of chips from the vending machine, and he said he wanted the new documents to reflect what actually mattered. I told him I didn't want anything for myself. He shook his head. "This isn't about you," he said. "It's about him." A modest trust fund was established in Amy's name. I was given full medical and legal power of attorney. The rest of his estate, accounts, property, savings, would remain his for life, with one clearly written clause. If anything happened to him, Claire would receive nothing. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like a correction, like the scales finally, quietly finding their balance. My father was discharged that weekend. He asked if he could stay with us. I told him yes, but on our terms, quiet. No grand speeches, no rushed attempts to undo decades of damage in a weekend. He agreed without argument. He moved into our spare room with a duffel bag and a stack of books. No drama, just a man trying to figure out how to exist in a space built on honesty rather than performance. The day he moved in, Claire showed up at his old house with her kids and a trunk full of groceries. She still had her key. The locks had already been changed. She stood on the porch for nearly 20 minutes trying to reach him by phone. He didn't answer. I didn't either. When she finally gave up, she slammed her car door hard enough that the sound echoed all the way down the block. She hasn't spoken to him since. Inside our home, things were different. My father spent most of his time at the kitchen table, watching Jamie draw or asking him questions about his favorite subjects, the shows he liked, the comics he was creating. His questions weren't always graceful. Sometimes he stumbled over the simplest things, but the effort was real, and it wasn't for show. One evening, after Jamie had gone to bed, my father sat across from me in the living room and asked, "Why didn't you give up on me long ago?" I'm still not entirely sure I have the right words, but part of it, maybe most of it, was Jamie. I didn't want him to learn hatred the way I had learned silence. I didn't want him growing up believing that some people are simply fixed, immovable, beyond change, because sometimes, really, unexpectedly, they aren't. And maybe the change doesn't erase what came before. Maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe it just gives the next chapter a chance to be written differently. My father started leaving notes under Jamie's bedroom door. Small, folded letters, one every few days. Jamie never said much about them at first, but I noticed he was taping them inside his closet door, like there was something worth keeping. And one afternoon, without fanfare, without any ceremony, I heard Jamie call him Grandpa, casually, like it had always been true. Claire tried to fight back legally. Her lawyer sent letters alleging coercion, manipulation, even elder abuse. But the medical evaluations were clean. The legal process had been thorough and properly witnessed. There was nothing to challenge. She had simply assumed he would never wake up. One evening, she appeared in my hallway. She didn't knock. She just stood there, waiting for someone to open the door. No one did. She waited 20 minutes and left. That was the last time I saw her. A few months later, my father asked if we could host a small dinner. Not a big event, just me, Jamie, and a few of the hospital staff who had cared for him. I said yes. We ate simple food on mismatched plates. Jamie talked for most of the meal about a comic book series he was creating. Whole universes, character backstories, hand-drawn maps. My father listened to every word like it was a keynote address from a scientist on the verge of a breakthrough. At the end of the night, he raised a glass of apple cider. "To my real legacy," he said. And this time, he was looking at Jamie, not in bloodlines or property, but in patience, kindness, and second chances. I didn't cry. I'm not sure why. Maybe I was just too full of something quieter than tears. But Jamie smiled, that wide open, unguarded smile that 10-year-olds haven't yet learned to hide. And that was more than enough. The house Claire spent years assuming she would inherit, my father donated it to a community scholarship fund established in Jamie's name. specifically for children with quiet voices and big ideas who've been overlooked by the people who should have seen them first. Claire never saw it coming. She thought legacy was something you claimed, something you positioned yourself for, something you secured with lawyers and paperwork, while the person you were supposed to love was fighting for his life in a hospital bed. But legacy isn't what you accumulate. It's what you leave behind in the people who carry you forward. And that legacy lives here now, in this story, in this house, in Jamie.